Recently, I've been seeing a lot of these Lego renders pop up on my YouTube, and while many of them look great, they all tend to share this sort of cartoony, not quite photoreal look. So as a professional in the industry and as a man with an untamed superiority complex, I thought I would share how I would go about creating one of these renders. I decided to use this Qui-Gon Jinn minifigure that I stole from an 8-year-old for the purpose of this task. I started by modelling the base minifig to real-world scale with clean, subdividable topology. I also included the interior structure of the various components for the sake of being thorough and also allowing for more accurate subsurface scattering later on. I then went on an ADHD-fueled dopamine binge and ended up rigging the whole thing so I could feel like a big man and sell it for profit. Given that I invested $0 into this project, I would describe this as a financial success. With that done, I started working on the hair. It's a kind of complex shape, so I thought I could be clever here by sculpting the details on top of a more simple base mesh. This ended up looking a bit too organic, more like a clay sculpture rather than injection molded plastic. So I decided not to be clever anymore and went back to modelling it the normal, boring way. I probably could have done a better job of this, but it was a Monday afternoon, so I was already quite drunk and I just thought this was the best it was going to get. I then modelled the lightsaber, starting with the hilt. I used 2 symmetry planes here to make things marginally easier, and then went over all of the edges with a soft sculpting brush to help sell the idea of a slightly increased thickness caused by electroplating over plastic. After that, I modelled the blade. I really had to knuckle down and focus for this bit. Before jumping into texturing, I UV unwrapped all of the components I had modelled so far. I sorted all of the islands into logical UDIMs to allow for maximum texture detail. I started the texturing process with the printed pieces like the head and the torso, as I really wanted to nail this effect. I did this by drawing out the artwork in Illustrator using photographs and the real minifig as reference. Once this was done, I saved them out and brought them into Nuke to add further detail. I added things like print bleed to the edges, misaligned some of the colour layers, added some faded and discoloured spots, essentially just recreated what I saw in the real thing. I even went to the pathetic effort of using this toy microscope to get some super up-close reference. I then got distracted and spent the next few hours using it to inspect everything in my immediate vicinity. With the print work done, I brought the files into Substance Painter. Here I textured the rest of the model, starting with the base colours and printed artwork, before adding all of the tiny details and imperfections I spotted on the real thing. I displaced the print work to give it some depth, before adding scratches, smudges, fingerprints, mould lines, Dorito dust, grain, and more. I was trying to think logically and realistically about where these elements are featured, rather than just throwing them everywhere. For example, pieces that articulate, like the legs and arms, leave behind a more defined scratch mark where they rub against other components. I also made sure to give the belt buckle a more metallic reflection, as well as increase its displacement so it appears like a metallic paint that's been layered on top of the other prints. For the lightsaber hilt, I really wanted to recreate the appearance of vacuum metallized plastic rather than just a super shiny metal or chrome. Softening the edges on the model definitely helped here, but I took this further by adding more of the details and imperfections that I observed with the microscope, like small scratches and dents from where I'd been chewing on it. These shiny lightsaber hilts were notorious for chipping, so I also added some tiny chipped areas where we can see the uncoated plastic underneath. Overall, I was pretty happy with the textures as a first pass. I probably could have done a better job, but it was a Tuesday lunchtime and I'd just eaten an entire rotisserie chicken, so I needed to lie down. To build a cool render environment, I started by creating this sort of platform thing using mecha bricks. I then exported this and brought it into Cinema 4D. I sat it on a plain backdrop, threw some standard surface shaders on it, and imported the minifig model. To light it, I started with an HDRI before adding a 3-point lighting setup consisting of a key, fill, and rim light to bring the model out from the background. I then added some additional lights just to bring out further details in an area where it was looking a bit flat or uninteresting. I also added 2 more lights built into the stage just to give slightly more interesting reflections as the minifigure rotates. To help sell the realism, I added some imperfections to the shaders and scattered some small pubes and dust particles across the surface. I probably could have taken a bit more time with this, but I'm lactose intolerant and I just inhaled like an extra large cappuccino, so I was needed elsewhere. For the minifig shader, I started by creating a base plastic shader and brought in the textures I'd exported from Substance Painter. I plugged in the base colour, roughness, metalness, normal and height maps and tweaked a couple of the values. For the specular reflection, I set an initial IOR value of 1.56, which is a good starting point for ABS, the type of plastic most LEGO is made from. I then started dialing in the subsurface scattering. Getting the values correct here is always crucial, as if you go too low, the plastic won't look very realistic. On the other hand, if you go too far, your render will look like an elaborate soap made for an obscure Lush promotion. I also exported this matte from Substance Painter so I could remove UDIM tiles that I didn't want the subsurface to affect, such as the hair and the head. The lightsaber hilt was a relatively straightforward process, as there was no subsurface to contend with thanks to the metallic coating. The lightsaber blade, however, took a bit more work to get right. I created another plastic shader, and this time I made it fully transmissive. I then assigned a greeny yellow colour to the base and a more vomit in a Weatherspoon sink yellow to the scattering. I gave it a depth of 0.7 cm and adjusted the scatter anisotropy until I felt it looked right. I then enhanced this further by adding a tiny, relatively weak disc light to the top and bottom of the blade to give it that fibre optic look. I then gave the shader a very subtle emission, which was masked by a facing ratio. Finally, to help sell the look, I modelled some bubbles and gave them a thin-walled transmissive shader using Arnold's nested dielectrics to make them really feel suspended in the polycarbonate blade. As a final finishing touch, I scattered a bunch of dust and fibres all over the minifig using a vertex map to isolate them to areas where they'd more logically be found. I also added some tiny hairs trapped between some of the joints, which was just another feature I saw when observing the minifig up close with the microscope. I probably could have done a better job of this, but it was starting to take up a lot of time and I was scared I wasn't going to get it finished. I mean, not really scared, I'm far more scared of things like hurricanes and loneliness, but I was pretty anxious to get it done nonetheless. Before hitting render and turning my room into a blast furnace for 8 hours, I set up a bunch of AOVs that I thought I may have needed in comp. I also added all of the lights into light groups in case I wanted to control those independently once it was rendered. With that done, I let it cook at 250 degrees centigrade for 8 hours until my computer was golden brown and piping hot throughout. I then brought the renders into Nuke to do a little bit of compositing magic. I started by cleaning up some of the noise and flickering still left in the render post denoising, and then I made some tweaks to the lightsaber blade to bring out more of the self-illumination. I then used the depth AOV I'd rendered to defocus the image, adding a very shallow depth of field to make the minifigure feel smaller. After that, I ran it through a bunch of lens emulations such as barrel distortion, chromatic aberration, bloom and vignetting. Finally, I split the whole thing into 4 separate tile renders to get around Nuke's export resolution limit because I'm too cheap to buy a commercial Nuke license. I then recombined these in After Effects, and with that, it was done. So there we go. I'm pretty pleased with the results myself, but if you feel otherwise, feel free to let me know in the comments down below. If you did like it though, please keep your positive feedback to yourself because I don't really do well with compliments. Finally, if you want to buy the model so you can try this out for yourself, there is a link in the description below which has a link to the... That link doesn't have a link, that doesn't make any fucking sense. There is a link in the description below which has the Cinema 4D rig and the unrigged model in FBX and OBJ formats. I have a few more videos like this planned, so if you do want to follow along and stay up to date, you can go ahead and subscribe.